A millionaire can walk anywhere without question, but a black Marine veteran can't even stand on his own front lawn without being accused of trespassing. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a mirror of pain, prejudice, and the fight for dignity that happens every single day in America. While wealthy individuals move through the world with invisible shields of privilege, Marcus Williams, a decorated Marine who served 3 tours in Afghanistan, couldn't even water his own garden without becoming a suspect. This isn't about one bad cop or one unfortunate misunderstanding. This is about a system that sees skin color before service, suspicion before citizenship. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. The morning of July 15th started like any other for Marcus. He had no idea that in less than an hour he'd be handcuffed on the very property he'd worked 2 jobs to afford, accused of a crime that existed only in the prejudiced mind of Officer Derek Coleman. What happened next would expose not just one man's racism, but an entire neighborhood's uncomfortable truth about who belongs and who doesn't. The sprinklers kicked on at exactly 6:30 a.m., just as Marcus Williams had programmed them 3 months ago when he'd finally saved enough to install the irrigation system. He stood on his front porch, coffee in hand, watching the water arc across his newly planted roses. A small victory in what had been a long journey to homeownership. At 34, Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced real danger and lived to tell about it. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him patience, discipline, and the value of fighting for something bigger than yourself. Now that something was this modest 2-bedroom house in Willowbrook Heights, a predominantly white suburb where he'd become the 3rd black homeowner in the neighborhood's 40-year history. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside. Built in 1987, it needed new gutters and a fresh coat of paint. But Marcus saw potential where others saw problems. He'd spent every weekend for the past 6 months renovating, refinishing hardwood floors, updating the kitchen, and transforming the overgrown backyard into something that made him proud. His neighbors had been polite. The kind of polite that came with tight smiles and conversations that ended a little too quickly. Mrs. Henderson next door had introduced herself once, mentioning how different the neighborhood was becoming. The Pattersons across the street waved from a distance but had never crossed over to say hello. Marcus told himself it would take time. Change always did. As he sipped his coffee, Marcus noticed a patrol car creeping slowly down Maple Street. Nothing unusual. Cops patrolled the neighborhood regularly. But something about the way the car slowed as it passed his house made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Old instincts from the battlefield kicked in. Assess, analyze, prepare. The car stopped. Officer Derek Coleman stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. 28 years old, with 15 months on the force, Coleman had grown up in a town just like this one, where everyone looked like him and everyone knew their place. He joined the police force, not to serve and protect, but to maintain order. His kind of order. Coleman surveyed the property with suspicious eyes. The house looked decent enough, but something felt wrong. He'd received a call about suspicious activity, someone lurking around the property, possibly casing it for a break-in. The caller had been very specific, a black male, medium build, acting like he owned the place. Marcus watched the officer approach, his military training keeping him calm, despite the familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd dealt with suspicious cops before, both overseas and back home. The key was to stay calm, be respectful, and provide whatever information they needed. Usually it ended with a handshake and a thank you for your service. But as Coleman's eyes locked onto his, Marcus realized this morning was going to be different. Very different. "Excuse me, sir," Coleman called out, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd practiced in the mirror. "I need to speak with you." Marcus set his coffee cup on the porch railing and walked down the 3 steps to his front lawn, hands visible and movements slow. Everything about his body language screamed non-threatening, but Coleman's posture suggested he'd already made up his mind about what kind of encounter this was going to be. "Good morning, officer. How can I help you?" Marcus kept his voice steady, professional, the same tone he'd used when briefing superior officers in Kandahar. Coleman pulled out his notepad, with theatrical precision. "I received a report about suspicious activity at this address. Someone matching your description was seen lurking around this property. Do you have permission to be here? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Permission? To be on his own property? He blinked, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. Officer, I live here. This is my house. Your house? Coleman's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. You're going to need to prove that. ID and documentation of ownership, please. Marcus felt the familiar surge of indignation he'd learned to suppress during his military service. Stay calm. Follow orders. Don't give them a reason. Of course, my ID is in my wallet, and I can get the deed if you need it. Can I ask who called this in? That's not your concern right now, Coleman snapped. What's your concern is providing identification and proving you have a right to be here. And keep your hands where I can see them. The morning sun beat down on Marcus's shoulders as he slowly reached for his back pocket. This was happening. Again, despite the uniform he'd worn with honor, despite the medals collecting dust in his bedroom drawer, despite working 60-hour weeks to afford this small piece of the American dream, he was still a suspect first, citizen second. Here's my driver's license, Marcus said, handing over the plastic card that clearly showed his current address, the same address where they were standing. Coleman examined the ID with the intensity of a forensic expert, turning it over multiple times as if searching for signs of forgery. This could be fake. I'm going to need additional proof. Property deed, mortgage documents, something official. Officer, the address on my license matches this address. I've been living here for 6 months. My neighbors can vouch for me. Marcus gestured toward Mrs. Henderson's house, where he could see the elderly woman peering through her curtains. Your neighbors? Coleman let out a cold laugh. One of your neighbors is exactly who called this in. Said there was a suspicious black male acting like he owned the place, probably casing it for a robbery. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not yet, but a dangerous clarity. This wasn't about suspicious activity or proper documentation. This was about something much older, much uglier, and much more personal. I need you to put your hands behind your back, Coleman said, reaching for his handcuffs. Wait, what? For what? Marcus's military discipline cracked slightly. I showed you my ID. I haven't broken any laws. You're trespassing on private property. And you're being resistant and argumentative. Turn around. Marcus's mind raced. This was escalating beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond anything that made sense. But he also knew that resisting would only make things worse. As the cold metal closed around his wrists on his own front lawn, he couldn't help but wonder, what would it take for a black man to truly be safe in America? Even on his own property, apparently, he was still just another suspect. The handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists as Coleman roughly guided him toward the patrol car. Each step felt surreal, like watching someone else's nightmare unfold in slow motion. 6 months of mortgage payments, countless hours of renovation, the pride of finally achieving something his father never could, all reduced to this humiliating walk across his own driveway. You're making a mistake, Officer Coleman, Marcus said, reading the name tag on the uniform. I'm a Marine veteran. I served 3 tours overseas. This is my home. Coleman pushed Marcus's head down as he shoved him into the back seat. Yeah? Well, I serve this community every day. And right now you're a threat to that community. Through the patrol car's window, Marcus watched his neighborhood come alive with curiosity. Mr. Patterson emerged from his house across the street, coffee mug in hand, surveying the scene with the detached interest of someone watching a movie. 2 joggers slowed their pace, phones already out and recording. Mrs. Chen from 4 houses down had stepped onto her porch, shaking her head in what looked like disapproval, though Marcus couldn't tell if it was directed at him or the situation. But it was Mrs. Henderson who made Marcus's heart sink. The 67-year-old widow stood at her property line, arms crossed, nodding in apparent approval as she spoke to Officer Coleman. She'd been the one. The woman who'd smiled and waved every morning for 6 months had been the one to call the police on him. Coleman approached Mrs. Henderson with the deference he'd never shown Marcus. Ma'am, thank you for calling this in. Can you tell me exactly what you witnessed? Mrs. Henderson adjusted her glasses and spoke loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. Well, officer, I've been watching this property for months now. Ever since the Johnsons moved out, there's been all kinds of strange activity. This morning, I saw this individual walking around like he owned the place, looking in windows, checking doors. It just didn't sit right with me. We've worked too hard to keep this neighborhood safe and, well, respectable. Marcus closed his eyes and leaned back against the patrol car's hard seat. Respectable. There it was. The word that carried decades of coded meaning. He'd heard it before, in different contexts, from different people. It never meant what it literally said. It meant something else entirely. Coleman scribbled notes, occasionally glancing back at Marcus with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been validated. Has he been bothering you directly, ma'am? Any threats or concerning behavior? Not directly. No, Mrs. Henderson admitted. But you know how it is, officer. First one moves in, then another, and before you know it, she let the sentence hang unfinished, its implications clear to everyone within earshot. Marcus thought about all the times he'd helped Mrs. Henderson carry her groceries. The snow he'd shoveled from her driveway without being asked. The evening he'd fixed her loose mailbox because he'd noticed it wobbling in the wind. 6 months of being a good neighbor, reduced to nothing by the color of his skin and the fears it apparently triggered. A new voice cut through the morning air. Excuse me, what's going on here? Sarah Martinez approached from the sidewalk, her nurse's scrubs suggesting she was either heading to or returning from a night shift. Marcus recognized her from the community Facebook group. She lived 3 blocks over and had always been vocal about neighborhood issues. But more importantly, she was holding her phone up, clearly recording. Coleman's demeanor shifted slightly. Cameras changed everything. And he knew it. Ma'am, this is an active police investigation. I'm going to need you to step back. This is a public street, Sarah replied firmly. And that man in your car is Marcus Williams. He lives here. I've seen his posts about renovating his house. What exactly are you investigating? The question hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time since this nightmare began, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Someone knew him. Someone was willing to speak up. But would it be enough to overcome the assumptions that had already taken root? Coleman's radio crackled to life, and Marcus caught fragments of the dispatch. Additional units requested, potential break-in suspect, backup en route. Things were about to get much worse. 2 additional patrol cars rounded the corner within minutes, their lights flashing but sirens silent. The kind of response reserved for situations where officers wanted to maintain control while sending a clear message to onlookers. Marcus watched through the rear window as 4 more officers stepped out, their hands instinctively resting near their weapons, despite the obvious lack of any physical threat. Sergeant Michael Torres, a 15-year veteran with graying temples and tired eyes, approached Coleman's patrol car first. He'd seen situations like this before too many times, in fact. The kind that started with a simple call and ended up on the evening news or worse, in a courtroom. Coleman, what do we have here? Torres asked, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd rather be dealing with actual crime than neighborhood paranoia. Possible break-in suspect, Sarge. Got a call about suspicious activity. Found this guy acting like he owns the place. Says he lives here, but Coleman shrugged, as if the rest was self-explanatory. Torres looked at the house, then at Marcus in the back seat, then at the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered. His instincts told him something wasn't right about this whole situation. Did you run his ID? Yes, sir. Address matches, but that doesn't mean anything. Could be a fake, or he could be using the owner's information. Sarah Martinez stepped forward, her phone still recording. Sergeant, I can verify this man's identity. His name is Marcus Williams. He's a Marine veteran, and he absolutely lives here. I've seen him working on his house every weekend for months. Torres studied Sarah's face, then looked back at Marcus. 20 years of police work had taught him to read situations quickly, and everything about this felt wrong. The suspect was calm, compliant, and clearly educated. The house was well maintained and obviously lived in, and now they had a witness vouching for his identity. Coleman, uncuff him. Let me talk to him. But Sarge, that's an order. Coleman's jaw tightened as he unlocked the patrol car door. Marcus stepped out slowly. His wrists red from the metal restraints and extended his hands so Coleman could remove the handcuffs. The humiliation burned, But Marcus kept his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago that showing emotion in situations like this only made things worse. Torres approached with the measured gait of someone trying to de-escalate. "Mr. Williams, I'm Sergeant Torres. I apologize for the confusion. Can you help me understand what happened here this morning?" Marcus rubbed his wrists and took a deep breath. "I was watering my lawn and having my morning coffee when Officer Coleman approached me. He said someone called in suspicious activity and asked me to prove I lived here. I provided my ID, which clearly shows this address, but he decided to arrest me anyway." Torres glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who was still standing at her property line but looking increasingly uncomfortable as more neighbors emerged from their houses. "Ma'am, you made the call this morning?" "Well, yes," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice smaller now than it had been earlier. "I saw him walking around the property and I thought, it looks suspicious." "What exactly looks suspicious about a man watering his own lawn?" Torres asked, his tone neutral but pointed. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed. Well, you never know these days. There's been so much crime in other neighborhoods, and I just thought." "You thought what exactly?" Sarah Martinez interjected, stepping closer. "You thought a black man couldn't possibly own a house in this neighborhood?" The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Mrs. Henderson sputtered. I'm not racist. I was just being careful." Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying the weight of deep disappointment. "Mrs. Henderson, I've lived next to you for 6 months. I've helped you with your groceries. I fixed your mailbox. I shoveled your driveway in the snowstorm last month. What changed between yesterday and today that made me suddenly suspicious?" The question echoed across the gathered crowd, and for the first time Mrs. Henderson had no answer. The silence stretched uncomfortably as neighbors looked at each other, seeing their community and themselves in a harsh new light. But Marcus's relief was premature. Coleman wasn't finished fighting, and Torres was about to discover that this situation was more complicated than anyone realized. Torres pulled Coleman aside, their voices low but their body language tense. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read the frustration in Torres's posture, and the defiance in Coleman's. After 20 years of military service and civilian life, Marcus had learned to recognize the moment when institutional loyalty battled against individual conscience. "Look, Sarge," Coleman said, loud enough for Marcus to catch fragments. "We can't just let this slide. I had probable cause. The call came in, I responded, and the suspect was non-compliant." "Non-compliant?" Torres's eyebrows shot up. "He provided ID and answered your questions. What part of that was non-compliant?" "He was argumentative, questioning my authority. You know how these situations can escalate?" Marcus felt his jaw clench. These situations. There it was again. The coded language that reduced his entire existence to a category, a type, a problem to be managed rather than a citizen to be served. Sarah Martinez had moved closer, her phone capturing every word. She'd worked as an ER nurse for 8 years, and had seen enough to know when someone was trying to cover their tracks. "Sergeant Torres, I've been recording this entire interaction. Mr. Williams has been nothing but respectful and cooperative. This is clearly a case of—" "Ma'am," Coleman interrupted, "I'm going to need you to stop interfering with a police investigation and move back." "What investigation?" Sarah shot back. "You've established that he lives here. You've had multiple witnesses confirm his identity. What exactly are you investigating now?" Torres rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar pressure that came with situations spiraling beyond common sense. In his 15 years on the force, he'd seen good cops make bad decisions and bad cops hide behind good badges. Right now, he was trying to figure out which category Coleman fell into. "Coleman, I want you to run a full background check on Mr. Williams. Criminal history, outstanding warrants, everything." Torres's voice carried a tone of finality that suggested the conversation was over. Marcus's heart sank. Even after proving he lived there, even after neighbors vouched for him, the system still assumed he must be guilty of something. They just had to find the right charge. "Sergeant," Marcus said, his military training keeping his voice controlled despite the rage building inside him. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I have a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. I've never been arrested, never been in trouble with the law. I pay my taxes. I vote in every election, and I've spent the last 6 months trying to be a good neighbor. What more do I have to do to be treated like a citizen instead of a suspect? The question hung in the morning air, witnessed by smartphones and security cameras, recorded for posterity and judgment. Torres looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw something that made him deeply uncomfortable. He saw himself, or his own son, or any of the young men he'd served with in the army 20 years ago. Men who deserved better than this. But the system had its own momentum, its own logic, its own way of protecting officers who made difficult judgment calls in ambiguous situations. Torres knew that admitting Coleman had screwed up would mean paperwork, investigations, potential lawsuits, and questions from supervisors who cared more about statistics than justice. Coleman returned from running the background check, his face showing a mix of disappointment and determination. Clean record, Sarge. But that doesn't change the fact that he was trespassing and resistant. I still think we should book him. Book him for what? Torres asked. Disorderly conduct. Failure to comply with lawful orders. We'll let the courts sort it out. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. Even with proof of innocence, even with witnesses, even with a clean record and military service, the system had found a way to make him guilty. He was about to be arrested for the crime of being black on his own property. But sometimes when institutions fail, individuals have to choose which side of history they want to stand on. Torres stared at Coleman for a long moment, weighing his options. 15 years on the force had taught him that sometimes doing the right thing meant going against the grain, even when it was easier to go along with the flow. He thought about his own son just starting college, and wondered what kind of world he was inheriting. Coleman, you're going to write this up as a welfare check that was resolved without incident? Torres said finally, Mr. Williams, I apologize for the inconvenience. You're free to go. Coleman's face flushed red. Sarge, you can't be serious. I made a legitimate arrest based on probable cause. You made a mistake based on assumptions. Torres cut him off. And now you're going to correct that mistake by doing the right thing. But Coleman had spent too many years believing that backing down meant showing weakness, that admitting error meant losing respect. In his worldview, Marcus Williams represented everything that threatened the natural order he'd sworn to protect. No, sir. I'm not backing down on this. I had reasonable suspicion. I followed protocol. And I'm not going to let political correctness override good police work. Coleman reached for his handcuffs again. Mr. Williams, you're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. The crowd of neighbors gasped as Coleman moved toward Marcus. But Torres stepped between them. Officer Coleman, I am ordering you to stand down. That's a direct order from a superior officer. And I'm refusing that order, Sergeant. I took an oath to uphold the law, not to cave to pressure from activists and race baiters. The words hit like bullets. Sarah Martinez's phone captured every syllable as other neighbors pulled out their own devices. Mrs. Henderson stepped back toward her house, finally understanding the monster she'd unleashed with her phone call. The other officers looked uncomfortable, caught between chain of command and a situation spiraling out of control. Marcus stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, while two armed officers argued about his fate on his own front lawn. He thought about his father, who'd worked 2 jobs his entire life and never owned a home. He thought about his brothers in arms, who died fighting for American ideals overseas, while those same ideals were denied to Americans at home. He thought about every black child who would grow up believing that no matter what they achieved, they would always be suspects first. That's enough, Marcus said quietly, but his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. Officer Coleman, you've made your position clear. Sergeant Torres, you've made yours. But let me make something clear to both of you. I am not going to be arrested on my own property for the crime of existing while black. The statement was simple, direct, and loaded with the weight of centuries of injustice. Marcus stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the measured confidence of someone who had finally reached his limit. I have done everything right, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. I served my country with honor. I worked hard to buy this house. I've been a good neighbor even to people who clearly don't want me here. But I will not be handcuffed on my own lawn by someone who sees my skin color as probable cause. Coleman's hand moved toward his weapon, and everything changed in that instant. The crowd stepped back, Sarah Martinez's phone shook as she continued recording, and Torres made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Coleman, if you draw your weapon on an unarmed citizen on his own property, I will have you arrested and fired before the sun sets today. Torres's voice carried the absolute authority of someone who meant every word. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats that felt like 3 hours. Coleman's hand hovered near his holster while Marcus stood motionless, refusing to back down or show fear. The entire neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see whether justice or prejudice would win this particular battle. Coleman's radio crackled with a new voice. All units, be advised that we have media en route to your location. Repeat, media en route. Someone had called the news. The first news van arrived within minutes, followed quickly by 2 more. Channel 7's investigative reporter Janet Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen, from down the street, stepped out with her camera crew, having received a tip from a neighbor who'd been watching the drama unfold and decided the world needed to see it. Marcus watched the media circus assemble on his quiet suburban street and felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because cameras meant accountability. Dread because cameras also meant his private humiliation was about to become public property. Sergeant Torres? Janet Chen approached with the confident stride of someone who'd covered dozens of similar stories. I'm Janet Chen from Channel 7 News. We received reports of an incident involving a black homeowner being arrested on his own property. Can you provide a statement? Torres glanced at the growing crowd of reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers. His phone was already buzzing with calls from the police department's public information officer, and he knew that within hours this story would be dissected by everyone from local talk radio hosts to national cable news panels. There's been a misunderstanding that we're working to resolve, Torres said carefully. No arrests have been made. Coleman stood rigid beside his patrol car, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. He could see his career imploding in real time, the video footage, the witness statements, the questions that would follow. In his mind, he was the victim here, a police officer just trying to do his job, being second-guessed and vilified for following protocol. But Marcus had reached a different conclusion. As he watched the news crews set up their equipment on his front lawn, he realized that this moment, humiliating as it was, represented something bigger than his personal grievance. This was about every black person who'd ever been treated as an intruder in their own neighborhood, every veteran who'd served overseas only to come home to discrimination, every citizen who'd played by all the rules and still found themselves on the wrong side of justice. My name is Marcus Williams, he said, stepping toward the cameras without waiting for permission. I live here. This is my house. I was having coffee on my own porch this morning when Officer Coleman decided I looked suspicious enough to arrest. Janet Chen turned her microphone toward Marcus, recognizing the moment when a source decides to tell their own story. Mr. Williams, can you walk us through exactly what happened? Marcus looked directly into the camera, his military training helping him stay calm under pressure. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 2nd Marine Division. I was awarded a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart defending the freedoms that apparently don't apply to me in my own neighborhood. This morning I was arrested on my own property because a neighbor decided that a black man couldn't possibly belong here. The words carried the quiet power of absolute truth, delivered without anger or theatrics. Marcus didn't need to shout or gesture dramatically. The facts spoke for themselves with devastating clarity. Mrs. Henderson tried to retreat into her house, but reporters were already knocking on her door, wanting her side of the story. Other neighbors found themselves reluctantly explaining their own inaction, their own assumptions, their own complicity in a system that had just played out its ugly logic in broad daylight. Officer Coleman, Janet Chen called out, do you have any comment about the arrest of a decorated Marine veteran on his own property? Coleman looked around at the cameras, the crowd, the mess his morning had become. He could double down on his original position, defend his actions, and hope the department backed him up. Or he could acknowledge what everyone could see, that he'd let his prejudices override his judgment and turned an innocent man into a suspect based solely on the color of his skin. No comment, Coleman said finally, the 2 words carrying the weight of a career-ending decision. But Marcus wasn't finished. He had one more thing to say. Something that would transform this local incident into a national conversation about justice, dignity, and what it truly meant to belong in America. As the news crews packed up their equipment and the last of the neighbors drifted back to their houses, Marcus stood alone on his front lawn, surveying the scattered remnants of what had started as an ordinary morning. The sprinklers had long since finished their cycle, leaving his roses glistening in the afternoon sun, a small beauty that had somehow survived the chaos of the day. 6 hours after being handcuffed on his own property, Marcus Williams had become a symbol. By evening, the video would have 500,000 views. By tomorrow, his story would be trending on social media, debated on cable news, and cited by politicians making speeches about police reform and racial justice. But right now, he was just a man standing in his own yard, trying to make sense of what his life had become. Janet Chen returned for one final question. Her camera crew capturing the golden hour light that made everything look cinematic and profound. Mr. Williams, after everything that happened today, do you regret moving to this neighborhood? Marcus considered the question carefully. He thought about Mrs. Henderson, who'd retreated into her house like a child hiding from consequences. He thought about Officer Coleman, who'd driven away in silence, his career and worldview in ruins. He thought about Sergeant Torres, who'd done the right thing despite the cost, and Sarah Martinez, who'd risked her safety to stand up for a stranger. You know, Marcus said finally, this morning I was watering my roses and thinking about how far I'd come. Son of a factory worker, first in my family to go to college, Marine veteran, homeowner. I thought I'd made it, you know? I thought I'd earned my place in the American dream. He paused, looking at the house he'd worked so hard to afford. But today taught me something important. It's not enough to earn your place in America if America doesn't believe you deserve to be here. The real question isn't whether I regret moving to this neighborhood. It's whether this neighborhood is ready to examine why it took 6 police officers and a news crew to convince them that a black man could belong here. The interview ended, but Marcus's words would echo far beyond that suburban street. Within days, Willowbrook Heights would become shorthand for American racial tensions in the 21st century. Mrs. Henderson would move away within a month, unable to face the neighbors who'd witnessed her shame. Officer Coleman would resign rather than face a departmental investigation. Sergeant Torres would be promoted, his decision to stand up for justice earning him respect from the community and his fellow officers. But perhaps the most profound change would be invisible to cameras and reporters. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus would find a handwritten note slipped under his door. It was from a young black family who'd been considering houses in the neighborhood but had hesitated, worried about whether they'd be welcome. Thank you, the note read, for showing us that we belong here too. Marcus would frame that note and hang it in his kitchen, next to his military commendations and the deed to his house. Because sometimes justice isn't about punishment or revenge, it's about opening doors that others can walk through, creating space for those who come after you, and refusing to let someone else's prejudice define your worth. As the sun set over Willowbrook Heights on that July evening, Marcus Williams watered his roses one more time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more questions, and the ongoing work of building a more perfect union. But tonight, he was simply a man tending his garden on his own property, claiming his place in an America that was slowly, painfully learning to live up to its promises. The roses bloomed anyway, indifferent to human prejudice, beautiful in their simple existence, a reminder that some things grow strong precisely because they refuse to be diminished by the smallness of others. And in the end, that might be the most powerful truth of all. Dignity cannot be arrested, worth cannot be handcuffed, and belonging cannot be denied by those who never had the right to grant it in the first place. A millionaire can walk anywhere without question, but a decorated Marine veteran had to fight for the right to stand on his own front lawn. The difference wasn't money or status or service to country. The difference was everything, and nothing at all.